Well, originally, I mean, my father was a lawyer, so he wanted me to study law. And then as I started getting into that, I really felt that I didn't want to be a lawyer. So he actually pushed me into computers. And at first I thought, oh, yeah, okay, fine. I mean, back then in the 60s, they were the size of a room, So, uh, but we had to do the full boat. We had to do the electrical engineering side, design, plus, computer programming. But I was always more of a trader. So, I was with RCA back then, and they wanted to, RCA had all the government contracts, and they decided to sell the computer divisions to IBM and Univac. So what happened was, I was given the luxury of volunteering for Thule, Greenland, Guam, or Vietnam. The married guys were getting London, Paris, like that. So I said, no, thanks. I really don't want to do this. And so I went back to trading. And the computer skills, I realized, gee, I could write a program that would actually do this. So in the 70s, I mean, we were all back then, I think, really into like AI and viewing what would happen and what we could do with it. And so that's pretty much what I did. I realized from the outset that the only way for a computer to actually be valuable would be to create a program that could understand everything itself and explore the world. And so you've had IBM, create these neural nets and things of this nature, and that line of thinking has led to, I would say, crazy theories in sci-fi that the computer suddenly wakes up, it just, becomes conscious and says it doesn't like your hairstyle,
Yeah, right.
decides to kill you or all humanity. I mean, that's very nice, but I mean, the theory behind that is you create this neural net, which is they're trying to, copy the mind or the brain, I should say. And then they think if you just throw a whole bunch of information in, somehow it just becomes conscious. I don't believe in that theory. Nobody's ever been able to accomplish something like that. But that's what all the sci-fi movies are on. So the AI that I developed was in the opposite direction, not trying to get it to become alive. Just mainly, I taught it how I would analyze things. So then basically giving it the entire world and said, okay, fine, go ahead, what do you come back with? And in that way, it does things that we humans maybe are incapable of doing. And because there's so many variables that are going on in the world economy, and everything does have an impact. So, I mean, the first thing that it came back and really kind of blew my mind was around 1980. It came out and it said the British pound was trading at 240. It said the pound was going to fall to par within 5 years, and the British economy was going to flip and align with the United States. And I said, what? And so I had to write routines to be able to have a conversation with it. So that got me into natural languages and stuff like that, to be able to talk to it, to say, how are you coming up with this? And basically, within just 3 years, it had picked up the capital flow changes for the North Sea oil. And sure enough, Britain then aligned more with the US and Canada as an oil exporter compared to the rest of Europe that wasn't. So, I mean, it was once you understood how it arrived at its conclusions, then it became obvious. But my question was, it would take maybe dumb luck or a whole team of people to actually constantly be looking at everything. but then you have conflicts of interest and things of that nature. So the program I developed it tracks the global capital flows. And during the 1980s, we had one client that was the Universal Bank of Lebanon. And they had found a ledger and in the basement where somebody had written down the Lebanese pound every day since, the mid-19th century. And they asked if we could build a model. I said, sure, okay, send it over, put it into the computer. And the computer came out and said, your country's going to fall apart in 8 days. I thought it was completely nuts. I thought, oh, something's got to be wrong with the data. But I called them and I said, look, what did the computer say? I said, this is what it came up with. I said, there's something obviously wrong. And they instantly said to me, well, what currency would you suggest? And I said, excuse me? And 8 days later was the Lebanese war. And the same thing happened. We had a client in Saudi Arabia, and he was big in shipping. And he called me and he says, what do you think gold's going to do tomorrow? Iran's going to start attacking shipping in the Gulf. I said, you telling me a war's going to start tomorrow? He says, yeah. What do you think gold's going to do? And then I began to understand that if you are going to invade a country or do something like that, you obviously are going to move your money in advance. And so that's basically what I learned from it. And even the government with 9/11, they started then looking at who bought options in advance, stuff like that, because basically our computer had shown this is what actually happens. And
they even knocked on our door after that happened because we had forecast something big is going to happen. We didn't know what it was at the time, but they did come in and ask us a bunch of questions.
Yeah, so I mean, somebody always knows something, and they move in advance to that. So I mean, if you really wanted to see was China going to invade, the United States, the first thing they would do would be starting to dump all U.S. government bonds.
Well, let's fast forward to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is currently underway, and what your model showed leading up to the invasion some month ago.
Well, we published, and you can Google it on our site, the first time the computer came up in 2013 and said Ukraine was going to be the place where everything starts. It's a lot of people don't quite know the full story of Ukraine. It was actually the third largest nuclear power in the world. It had more nukes than China. So the Belgrade Agreement in 91 was that they gave up all their nuclear power, and in return, NATO guaranteed they would not move in, and Russia said, fine, as long as they stay neutral, we're happy. And then you get this guy, Zelensky, and what the mainstream media is not really reporting, the same oligarch, Kominsky, who funded Zelensky, is the same guy that owned the energy company that hired Hunter Biden. I mean, the connections in there are so corrupt. They're off the chart. I mean, Ukraine is probably the most corrupt country you're going to see in a very, very long time. And Zelensky was elected on this idea that he was going to end corruption. You saw major protests in Romania over the same issues, corruption. And so the problem here is it is really the way the press in the West is presenting this, so that Putin is this evil guy and everything's his fault. It's just not true. And in any kind of a war, there's propaganda on both sides. And what you have to understand is that when for example, when Biden came out and said pretty much as long as he doesn't go into all of Ukraine and it's just a minor invasion, we don't care. Then the very next day, the White House comes out and has to clean that up. All right. Well, he didn't really mean that, et cetera. But there was a security meeting in Munich, and he sent for some God unknown reason Harris. It should have been the Secretary of State, but she goes there, and then off the cuff, it seemed as though she then just tells Zelensky that go ahead, you should join NATO, which is a total violation of the Belgrade Agreement. She does that on February 20th, but nobody comes out to clean that up. And then Putin invades 4 days later. That was the one thing, that agreement that Ukraine was going to remain neutral. And here you have her saying, join NATO, which is very, very strange. It makes me wonder that somebody in her camp, because I think she does the same thing as Biden, just reads the cue cards, So I'm not even sure she was aware of what she was even saying. But when they do that, usually the White House comes out and clarifies it. But there was no clarification. So I believe what you're looking at here is they need this war. And why do I say that? Mainly because I've been fighting with various different central banks for the last 10 years. And, I've been arguing that, look, this whole thing is going to come and fall apart. The ECB went to negative interest rates in 2014. They're still negative. All right. They've wiped out their bond market. And then in August of 19, suddenly the New York banks were not willing to lend in the overnight repo market to any European bank. And the Fed had to step in. Well, the New York banks will not accept any government bonds from Europe as collateral. Why? Because they know they're going to default. And they're negative to begin with. So the only real buyer has been the ECB. So the problem here is that you're looking at, they have effectively bankrupted all the pension funds in Europe. By law, they had to have 70%, some of them 90% of government debt that pays negative. These pension funds need to make, on average, 8% annually to break even. So, it's a total, complete mess.
In what capacity does the war help get them out of this? It doesn't realign the debt load, or it doesn't reset the bonds.
No, it allows them to default.
Yeah.
They need the excuse. And this is where Klaus Schwab in his Great Reset, what he's been pushing is exactly this.
Just to clarify before you get into this point, Klaus Schwab is the founder and the chief executive of the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos twice a year.
Yes. Now, probably a lot of people have seen his 8 points for Agenda 2030, and it says you'll own nothing and be happy. All right. He's not actually advocating communism. What it is that they're trying to make it sound that they're doing this for you. The governments can't default. If they do, there's been millions of people with pitchforks dragging them out of their parliament over there. So how do you pull this off? It makes it sound like we're going to relieve you of all your debts, and we're doing this for you, when in fact they're the ones that really have to default. So that's what he's really saying when he says you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It is, his argument is basically to be Marxist in a sense. Him and several other academics that I know, they view that Marxism would have been successful had they also control the United States and Europe. They feel that since we were not Marxists, that therefore that's why communism failed. But that's just total nonsense. But the academics, that's basically what they tend to do. They always tend to be more left leaning. So you're looking at, that is the ultimate real problem they have. And the war, these people think that, like after World War II, you had Bretton Woods, and then you reestablish the world monetary system. And so they really think that they're going to be able to pull off Bretton Woods too here. But I think they also think that they can keep this thing conventional, et cetera. And the other problem they've had was that there were three major obstacles to this. And that was, one was Donald Trump, because he was against the whole climate change, et cetera. So basically they got rid of him. The next one is Putin. And the third is Xi in China. So they feel that if they can cause regime change over there, that it would be better. But I mean, that they might be able to get Russia back into their fold. I just don't see that as happening. And our computer basically says that they're going to fail.
Yeah. Well, the computer, the last you mentioned, it was the model showed in 2013 that the beginning would start in Ukraine. And in fact, in 2014, that's when China first annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Just maybe connect the dots between what the model was saying in 2013 and then what actually happened in 2014.
Yeah,
because that's a precursor. If you talk to any Ukrainian, I played tennis with a guy who's a researcher studying here at the at Johns Hopkins University, and he's Ukrainian. His family is back in the Ukraine. He's not been in a good mood for the last couple of weeks, rightly so. He said we never the first annexation of Crimea was just the beginning. We've really been at a state of war since then, or a state of readiness, and then for the past month, it's been missiles raining on Ukrainian cities. So their thought is that they have been under siege for some time now. But your model suggested that was about to take place back in 2013.
Yeah, and I unfortunately, I think there's a fair amount of evidence is starting to come up that Zelensky is taking orders from somebody else other than his own people.
Well, he's also part of he's a member of the World Economic Forum.
Yes.
Is that true? Yeah.
But I mean, and he was elected to reduce tensions with Russia. And I think what a lot of people don't understand because of the propaganda, Putin's invading a sovereign nation. Ukraine was never a sovereign nation. All right. It was always this land in the middle between Poland, et cetera. The borders of Ukraine were drawn by Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. Crimea was always Russian. He just simply allocated it to Ukraine to manage. The people there are all Russian. They speak Russian. They're not Ukrainian. And the same thing in the Donbass. Now, when 2014 took place, I came out and I said, look, Ukraine should just simply be split according to the language and let it, and then we would have a reasonable, position. Putin went in to take Crimea because that was a very, very major military port for them. So when you start getting into a revolution, and then the risk was that, they would cut, Russia off from Crimea. So, I mean, it was, you just should have let Donbass, vote like the Minsk agreement said. But, you're putting, it just seems unreasonable that you put the entire Ukrainian population at risk for what? For holding on to two areas that are ethnically Russian to begin with. it just doesn't make sense. And I mean, if you're into world peace, you say, okay, fine, you go your way, we go our way. But if you're into aggravating things, then I think it's something different.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that's what's going on here. And I mean, even Nigel Farage stood up on the floor of Parliament over there back in 2014. And he says, you are inviting war here, because NATO was there saying, oh, maybe you should join. During Maidan, there were people waving, Euro, flags. They thought they were going to become part of Euro. So it was, he was arguing that, the EU was actually encouraging this. So,
and you're connecting the dots from that sort of poking the bear, so to speak, that they're doing it intentionally to clean up their own economic mess.
It seems to be, because I think that if you look at this, even the Agenda 2030.
That's the World Economic Forum's agenda.
Yeah, and the idea is that the United Nations becomes the new one world government. And he even has in there that the United States would surrender its nuclear power to the UN. It's quite bizarre, really. But it's the only way to do that is if you also create regime change in China and Russia. So it happens to be very convenient. And often the way history is written, we don't know for decades afterwards as to what's the real true story behind
what the motives are, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I think the motives are pretty clear as far as if you look at them trying to create this one world government idea, which has been around for a long time. I mean, that was even used to form the EU. I mean, there's a clip on my site, which even of the old French President Hollande and Merkel standing up and even admitting that this will end European wars. And that's just not the case. But, particularly in Europe, I mean, America was different in the sense that it worked because actually we discriminated against everybody when they got off the boat. If you wanted to get a job, you had to learn to speak English. So at the end, that became the melting pot. So you ask an American, what are you? Go, well, I'm half German, half Irish or whatever. But you don't really see that in Europe. You don't see somebody from Scotland going down and marrying a girl from Sicily. They speak different languages and different cultures. Where in America, everybody, once they spoke the same language, we all ended up with the same culture, basically. And although we're all, mixed ethnically. So Europe, it's still very much divided. And you can bet you that if a French girl brings home a German boy to her father, he's going to say, you do know what they did to us, I mean, I've been in Athens when they were protesting against the EU and they're dressed up in Nazi uniforms blaming Germany, so the old, divisions and hatred live a long time there.